Hello, everybody. Welcome to Module 12. In this module, we will talk about exercise and psychological well-being, as well as exercise behavior and adherence. Now, I want to start out by saying that when you look at the two associated chapters in this module, which are, again, chapters 18 and 19 in the text, your text does a lot to go into the details of how exercise affects anxiety, depression, different mood states, and of course, also does a lot related to understanding the physiological of, the physiological benefits to exercising. And those things are really important. And particularly in the avenue of depression and anxiety, we're going to talk about that today. But I personally, because again, it's an area of research that I am heavily invested in, I could go on and on about that. So I want you to rely a lot on your reading, a lot on the conversations that hopefully we're able to have throughout the semester to give you a little bit more of that. But I definitely took some out of the presentation, some of that information in order just to make sure that we stay on task, that we cover everything we need to cover, or else you'd be hearing my voice the whole day. And I'm sure that at this point in the semester, you're probably a little tired of hearing my voice. So we'll go through those parts pretty quickly. But again, I just want you to know that there is a chunk of that material within this module that gets heavily addressed from the text. So just make sure you're keeping up with your reading. And particularly at this point in the semester, if you haven't done as well as you'd like on certain assignments, on quizzes, on homework assignments, and you're not doing your reading or you're not keeping up with your reading, just make sure that you are doing that. And remember that even if you're watching these modules once a week, like you're originally supposed to, or ideally supposed to, you still want to treat this like a regular class that would meet twice a week. So you could be using that other quote unquote class meeting to do your reading. So you want to make sure you're allocating time. Just because this is an asynchronous course doesn't mean that it deserves any less time than any other course. Okay, let's get right into it. So why is exercise important for psychological well-being? Like I said, the text goes into great detail why it's important for physical well-being. And again, we're going to briefly talk about that. But let me throw just a couple of statistics and important findings your way. There's no denying that technology, particularly us as a technologically advanced society, we're under more stress, we're under more demands. People are working harder than ever before. There are a lot of people, and with a lot of people, you start to see things like depression, anxiety, related mood disorders increase tremendously, especially in collegiate athletes. And one of the many reasons why you see this in collegiate athletes compared to maybe college students that aren't in sport is because there's not only a mental health stigma, which athletes and coaches nowadays are trying to fight, but also there is a lack of willingness to ask for help. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the stigma. In some of my research, what I found is that even, for example, let's say you have an athlete that goes to see a physician, and maybe the physician, the athlete complains of constantly being tired, not having an easy time concentrating, not being able to enjoy the things that he or she once enjoyed, things that could be associated with perhaps a depressive disorder. But even though the symptoms are there, that would be the same for that athlete just like you would see in a non-athlete. A physician, a sports physician, is more likely to label the athlete, whether intentionally or unintentionally, with things like overtraining and maybe not getting enough rest, as opposed to anxiety and depression. There's tons of studies that show that athletes just really have a hard time expressing themselves, having a hard time expressing their experiences when it comes to mental health. And I think based on some of the topics we've covered throughout the semester, I think it's no surprising to see that. This is really interesting. By the end of the year, which was the time you're listening to this was last year, depression was second only to cardiovascular disease as the leading cause of death and disability. Now, this text especially by this finding, is probably a couple years old information. Typically, when you get a textbook, the information in the textbook, at least at print, is somewhere between 2 to 3, 4, 5 years old. So I actually don't know if this is true as of now per se, but it's definitely among the top causes of death. And that's really, sad to think that, depression as a mechanism that leads to suicide is causing just as much, or it's getting closer in terms of how fatal it can be to other things such as cardiovascular disease. A couple other statistics I'll throw your way. Anxiety disorders and depressions cause the public $57 billion a year. This shows us that these disorders, these mental health disorders, are a significant issue. There's no running away from them. Generally speaking, or I should say exercise positively influences general feelings of psychological well-being and decreases anxiety and depression. Something that becomes really interesting to note is when we talk about exercise, typically where we see most of the benefits, both psychologically and physically, is in moderate exercise, or moderate to vigorously controlled, because there are, of course, going back to the comment I made earlier, when overtraining does take place and someone is generally fatigued all the time, pushing their body beyond their capabilities, both physically and mentally, then you start to see maybe the opposite, right? You start to see negative influences on the feelings of well-being and perhaps increases in anxiety and depression. And then generally taking the US and the Canadian populations from the global perspective and looking at them individually, we know that there is tons of information that does support the fact that there is a relationship, there is a positive association with someone that has good mental health, a lack of certain mental health disorders, and partakes in physical activity. Again, we're going to get to see that as long as it's not rigorous activity constantly, that's not permitting someone to recover, to rest, because again, part of being an athlete, especially at the highest level, is knowing your body and knowing when to give yourself enough rest, both physically and mentally. We've heard this concept of well-being already. I keep saying psychological well-being. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that we look at these 6 dimensions: self-acceptance, positive relationships, autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth, purpose in life, and we kind of jam them all together into this general feeling of feeling good. And I know it's not a great way to necessarily say it, but when you look at these 6 individual things, you can imagine that, yeah, if someone has a good point of view in one of these dimensions, you can imagine that they feel a little bit better about themselves. So when we talk about psychological general well-being, we're seeing someone that excels in these dimensions. And that's when we say things like exercise is a positive association, positive relationship with increases in psychological well-being. We're talking about increases in these 6 dimensions. Looking specifically again at just anxiety and depression, a couple more statistics that I want to mention. Mental health issues account for 30% of the total days of hospitalization in the US and 10% of the total medical costs. That's a lot. Think back to that amount that I mentioned earlier, that was in the billions in terms of how much these disorders are costing everyone on a yearly basis. And again, there's no, again, this is a real rough summarization of all the information that's in the text and all the information that I will continue to hopefully share with you throughout the semester. But although there hasn't been a cause and effect, there is a association, there is a relationship where, again, regular exercise with adequate recovery, with adequate amount of workload, overload on the body, is associated with reductions in anxiety and depression. And kind of just to reinforce that point, people can benefit both through anxiety reduction and depression reduction by exercising without being involved in intense, high intensity aerobic activity. So in other words, high intensity aerobic activity, certain sports at a high demand are not what is always needed to reap these benefits. And that's great news because not everyone is obviously a pretty intense, high level elite athlete. And that's a good thing. That just bodes to the reason why we want to encourage as many people to exercise as well as much as possible for reasons aside from the uh, obvious in the physical realm. People can strength train, people can do yoga, that those have shown to have positive effects on depression and anxiety. People can compete in different types of competitive sport. And when we talk about competitive sport, that can be recreational. Again, doesn't have to be for a specific team or a specific school or organization, but it can be, just generally in in a type of environment in which with your friends or with people you just compete with casually. Next part of this, it's just quickly me just reminding you of how we can separate anaerobic and aerobic exercise. I'm sure if you've gotten to this point in your coursework, and I'm sure there's plenty of other courses you're taking, especially if your major is like say science, in which you get this, you understand this. So I don't think I need to spend that much time with this. There's also some information in the text about chronic versus acute exercise. Again, pretty simple. I don't think I have to get into that too well. Your mood does increase through exercise. And again, this kind of goes into the effects of exercise on depression and anxiety. So there can be mood enhancements. So someone's mood can improve through exercise, and mood states are very closely tied into depression and anxiety. So what you see is in front of you, these recommendations are things that can be done to exercise to, just generally improve mood and again, have those better consequences on depression and anxiety. Regular breathing during exercise, competition that's unhealthy or unnecessary, unpredictable, stressful activity can sometimes decrease mood, especially if it's not controlled. Kind of getting out of your rhythm can disrupt mood. Not exercising enough, not doing enough intensity, not working hard enough to affect your mood, that can be detrimental, and make it enjoyable. That is one that I cannot stress enough. And I've taught and I still teach a couple of strength training courses, not at NJCU as of yet, but I've taught them at East Stroudsburg University, the other university where I work. And one of the first things I stress is that the concept of fitness, and obviously that ties into what we're talking about today with exercise, can be so broad that ultimately probably the best thing you can do is find what makes you happy in terms of what activities you like and do that the most. Stick with that. So for some people, that's running. For some people, that's strength training. Others, that's swimming. Others, that's playing basketball. And again, for many, it might be combinations of that. And it's still important to diversify training. But for the most part, when we're talking just strictly mood, and obviously some of the benefits that come with this as well as other than mood, I should say, doing what you enjoy, that's what's going to make you enhance your mood the most, right? Finding the activity that you really enjoy, that's what's going to help you the absolute most. And then ultimately, just to kind of summarize what we've been getting at in terms of exercise helping with different anxiety, depression symptoms, increasing general psychological well-being, and enhancing mood. This is kind of just a summary slide of the different benefits that we can see. So self-esteem goes up, self-concept goes up, people enjoy life more, especially if it's an exercise that they enjoy doing anyway. Stress goes down, again, as long as appropriate recovery is being taken place. Self-confidence increases, and we've spent plenty of time talking about the importance of self-confidence. Mood states elevate, which is huge, again, for enhancing mood. And again, not to beat a dead horse here, but decreased levels of anxiety and depression. So how does this happen? How does exercise do this? Do all these things, evoke all these benefits? Well, there's a couple different explanations for it. And really, to no surprise, we can break down these explanations into both physiological explanations and psychological explanations. So some of the explanations that researchers have come up with in terms of trying to explain how exercise does this on the physiological side include things such as an increase in cerebral blood flow, change in brain neurotransmitters, increase in oxygen uptake, reduction in muscle tension, structural changes in the brain, increase in a particular type of receptors. And then on the psychological side, we think about things such as reasons of enhanced feeling of control, competency feelings increase, self-efficacy. We've talked about that before. That increases the ability to have more social interactions because, again, usually when people start engaging in exercise and sport, there is a tremendous element of social interaction that comes with that. More self-concept, more self-esteem increases, and just more opportunities to do something that breaks the norm and increases opportunities for fun and enjoyment. We also, again, thinking about both those different physiological and psychological explanations, we also start to see that there can be changes to personality and development of the self, kind of drawing on those explanations that I just mentioned as more reasons why it works, right? Why exercise evokes all these benefits. And then just one last point I want to make. Ultimately, what makes the most sense is the fact that, it's not just, if you start to embrace the fact that it's not just necessarily one of those explanations that probably is what is making these effects, but instead it's all of them or a combination of all of them. And when you really embrace that, then you really start to, further buy into the fact of what exercise can do and the true benefits associated with exercise. Okay, something I did want to include in today's presentation, something known as a runner's high. And for those that, run, maybe you ran either track and field, cross country in high school, or maybe you do that now at NJCU. This is something that or if you do this on your own. And again, it's called runner's high, and it started being associated with people who run long distances, but it can really happen in any sport. It's similar to being in a flow state. And what you feel, and it's kind of hard to put in words, but you look at some of those words and those definitions, it's euphoric, it's unexpected, you feel just really good, and you appreciate your surroundings. You don't care about the time where you're going. You're just in the moment, and you're focused on just doing the activity that you like, and that's what's making you really happy. And if it sounds silly, then you probably have never experienced it. But if you have, think a bit of just being in the zone when you're doing a particular sport or exercise and you don't care about anything else and you just feel good. Your body feels good. Your mind feels good. And that's really what this is. And actually, there's been research on this. And there's evidence that there's actually a chemical reaction, associated with endorphin release in the brain when this occurs. So it's not just people saying this, but instead there's also some sort of underlying biological response happening when people reach this point. So like I said, runner's high can happen, really that flow state can happen doing anything for the most part, but where it originated from, where it got more popular and probably is still the most popular in running, comes from characteristics when there are few distractions, when the weather is appropriate, right? It's not thunderstorming, it's not really cold, it's not really hot, it's comfortable. The runner, the athlete doesn't have to think about the weather, it's easy to breathe, and it's going on for a period of time, right? They're in a flow for a period of time. And this flow state can vary, in terms of how often someone gets in it. Maybe they get in it every time they run a long distance. Maybe they get in it every week, once a week, or depending on certain types of conditions in the day, that's when it happens. And then I know we keep saying running, but you can really be applied to anything. But again, if you've experienced this before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So this is a snippet of one of those benefits that we've talked about in terms of elevating mood state. This is sort of like the ultra elevation of mood states. Something else I wanted to include was this really interesting piece of information that your text talks about. it just mentions the fact that obviously, like we just said, one of the benefits of exercise on the psychological well-being front is increasing self-confidence. Now, it's no surprise that, and I know here the finding is associated to women, but this can apply to men and really anyone else as well. But those that generally have doubt about their own physique, don't trust themselves in terms of technical skills, or they have some sort of anxiety about exercising, when you put them in an environment where they can see themselves, and again, the best thing that comes to mind is gyms or exercise rooms or facilities with mirrors. Those that have that doubt and are constantly having to see themselves, they start to have a negative affect. And when we say affect, that's essentially disposition, someone's mood, right? Someone's behavior starts to be negative. So in other words, they start to feel more anxious, they get down on themselves. But people that generally you see here are more confident, more active, even if they're not necessarily, uh, experts in their sport or expert in their types of exercise that they do, but they feel good. They have a underlying base of self-confidence before they even get into the setting. Then there's no negative effect. So what we're trying to say here is if someone comes into an environment that's causing them to self-reflect, in this case, in the case of mirrors, and they have some underlying basis of self-confidence in this manner, then something like mirrors won't necessarily hurt them. But if someone's already, already self-doubting themselves, already anxious, worried about their physical appearance, so on and so forth, and you include mirrors into the equation, then that's potentially going to make things worse. So I just thought that was really interesting. A little bit off topic there, but I do think somewhat relevant to how exercise does impact psychological well-being. Okay. Before we switch gears and get into adherence and just general exercise behavior, I just want to play you a short clip here by Dr. Jay Kimisic, and he will just talk about some of the relationship between, again, exercise and psychological well-being, particularly looking at the mental health aspects.
That role between physical activity and mental health, psychological well-being, whatever term you want to use, has by now been really shown to be very strong. So I think we've gotten to the point where we know that physical activity affects positive affect, affects various aspects of psychological well-being like autonomy or how you feel about yourself, self-expressiveness. There's a lot of good things that come out of regular, sustained physical activity. So I think that link is very strong. So we know there's this link between physical activity and psychological well-being. The challenge has been is that the data still shows that even though people understand and are aware of that strong relationship, we're still struggling with figuring out how to help people move. And there's a variety of reasons for that. If you want to look at the socioeconomic context, bigger picture type thing. But I think the thing that's getting more interesting is that some of the work I've been doing and some others is really zooming in on this idea of well-being. So kind of starting on the other side, if we know activity is linked to psychological well-being, but it's still not really having much of an effect, why? Well, because it's how people feel about themselves. And what the literature is starting to show is that things like purpose and meaning in one's life really influence the types of behaviors that you're attracted to or not attracted to. So we know that if, for example, if you're feeling bad and you exercise, you're going to feel better. The problem is we also know that if you feel bad about yourself, your chances of moving your body or going towards foods like fruits and vegetables that are good for you are more challenging, because the data shows when people feel bad about themselves, they tend to approach things that are not so good for them. So that's where really I think the role of well-being comes into the picture. It's a pretty exciting time, I think, in this area in terms of exercise psychology or health psychology, because that whole idea of purpose and meaning on the front end hasn't really been attacked all that vigorously until maybe the last 5 years or so. And they're starting to show that's a significant hole in the literature. And there's some interesting stuff coming out about more of this holistic take on people's lives has to be looked at in order to really understand why people move their bodies. What I'm talking about is that for years, we've kind of utilized this idea of physical activity being important because it'll help people live longer, make them feel better. But that kind of comes from this idea of kind of a biomedical model where we look at risk factors and how they're linked to disease. But I think that the new work is really focusing much more on the person, not necessarily the behavior. So you kind of start with the person of interest, not the behavior of interest.
Okay, a couple great points there. And he's right, especially as we're trying to figure out why some people are not deciding to exercise or not willing to exercise, outside of general athletics. Because we're, with that comment, obviously I'm focusing on the general population. We're trying to understand why they don't want to or have no desire to at times, even though they know all of the positive outcomes. So real interesting stuff. And for a lot of you, depending on what you want your careers to be, or maybe you're already in some certain jobs when you're working with people who, need to exercise, or I mean, everyone technically needs to exercise, but people who could really benefit from exercise, and or you're working with athletes, getting to the root of why people don't want to do something, or even why they want to do something, that is an approach that is very valuable, and I think something that you should definitely think about as you move forward. All right, so let's stay here. Like I said, now we're going to get into exercise behavior and adherence. So getting people to exercise is important. That was the first part of the presentation. And we know that, fortunately, most athletes are, involved in this routine exercise. So that's good. But obviously people outside of the athletic population, which is the majority of people, they do not exercise. So it's not only important to get people to exercise, but it's also important to get people to stick to the program, right? Stick to exercise. Most people do not meet minimum exercise requirements of moderate exercise. Obesity rates are high, they become even higher in minority races. When the United States set the physical activity guidelines on a national scale in 2008, you look at those even now, and still not a lot of people meet those guidelines. And it's sad, but even looking at high school, you still don't have a lot of students that are getting physical activity. And especially you think about the last year, how everything's gone online. I would imagine that there's been a hit even more so to maybe some of those high school students, really all students, think about college students as well, that maybe weren't as active as before. I even think about myself, who, I identify myself as a pretty active person. I like strength training, playing basketball, doing all types of things. I'm also a personal trainer on the side, help people out through certain things. I enjoy running 5Ks, Spartan races, those kind of things. But I promise you this, when everything transitioned to being online and I was on Zoom almost every day, I definitely was less active than I was before. And my body felt it, right? I didn't feel as good, both physically and mentally. And it wasn't until things got a little bit better, and, obviously the weather improved as well as we got through the year, and things opened up again, where I was able to get back to myself. So if I felt that way, I can only imagine how some people feel, especially if they're not regular exercisers. And then just some other things to throw your way. Again, high obesity rates. Typically 1/3 of adults in the US identify as obese, and obese ties into the body mass index. People who, and this is really interesting, people who don't make a lot of money are more likely to be obese. Again, that's a relationship, not cause and effect. And the research shows that the reason for that is because if you look at supermarkets and healthy food options and fast food options, the cheaper, most affordable food is fast food, right? It is food that is not good for you. You could go to McDonald's and feed a family of four for maybe 20 bucks versus, if you want to have a home cooked meal, not only do you have to look into the cost of the individual ingredients, but obviously making sure that you have an appropriate kitchen that you can use in appropriate time if you're constantly working or doing what you have to do. So there's parallels between obesity, health status, and definitely the socioeconomic background of people. There's obesity present among the youth. That's unfortunate as well. And generally, not by large percentages, but generally men are more likely to be active than women. But at this point, it's a pretty 50-50 split. So, regardless if someone, is of a male sex or a female sex, they're still at a risk of obesity if they do not, keep up with regular activity guidelines, and especially if their nutrition is not where it needs to be. So reasons to exercise. And again, I don't have to repeat these over and over again, but hopefully you've heard these time and time again. Weight control, reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and other diseases, stress and depression, anxiety and depression. We've talked about that before. Enjoyment, building self-esteem, socialization. What are the barriers to exercise? What are the reasons people give for not being able to exercise? Well, the most common ones are lack of time, lack of energy, lack of motivation, and sedentary behavior. So, if someone has a job that's consuming a lot of their life, they have a hard time maybe fitting in exercise. If someone has a family that's taking part of a lot of their life, and the family naturally doesn't live a healthy lifestyle, and an active lifestyle, and that could be difficult for that person as well. So when you work with people, whether or not they're athletes, and you encounter these kind of barriers, reasons for maybe not practicing during off season, they have a job back home, or reasons for, you name it, you come up with a scenario. But if you encounter a barrier, you have to get creative in how you try to solve these. And I think ultimately relying on a lot of, at least for this course, relying on a lot of the different psychological skills that we've talked about is a really good place to start. And if you're hopefully watching all of these lectures in order, think back to the conversations we just had related to goal setting and concentration and self-confidence. There's tons of things you can pull from those presentations, from the material in the textbook, to help combat these barriers. So generally, why do people have a hard time sticking to exercise? We talked about it when we saw the video, the first video that we watched, in that people know that exercise is good, both on the physical side and the psychological side. So why do people have a hard time? Well, people maybe, or sometimes people go to work with, personal trainers or other fitness professionals that ignore the psychological side. Maybe they just focus on the fitness side. That's a downfall. So in some ways, they don't have conversations with the people that want to get into exercising about all the benefits, about emphasizing the benefit of improving psychological well-being and all the things that we saw that was a part of psychological well-being. Things become overly difficult, overly restrictive. People lose motivation. Things are too intense too soon, especially for beginners. I remember when I was doing my personal training certification through NASA, National Academy of Sports Medicine, a couple of years ago. I remember one of the things I took away from that program was that the best personal trainers are the ones that really try to help their clients and not just make them sore, right? If you go into personal training and your goal is to not have the individual walk the next day and just kill them in your training, then you're going to lose out on a lot of people. And a lot of people are going to work with you for a week or two, and then, just be totally done with you, right there. It's your methods are going to go over their head, and their detriment's going to be greater than any benefit that you could propose. And again, when people are engaged in exercise, if they don't take empowerment, if they don't become empowered to, again, have that intrinsic motivation to want to eventually enjoy to exercise, then it's not going to stick. Second video we have here, we have Dr. Rob Weinberg. He's going to spend some time talking to us about Things that we can do, or things that others can do to help people exercise, or to help facilitate the exercise process and help people stick to adherence. So let's check this one out.
First of all, it is very hard to change behavior, and that's why we get so many people who don't exercise. One of the things that I think we can do to help people is find exercise that is enjoyable or fun to them. It's a very, very rare person who will continue exercise on a treadmill or something like that if it's not fun. They may do it for a while, but not for a long period of time. They need to find some activity, whether it's sport-related activity like racquetball or something, or if it's walking or cycling, but something that they enjoy if you're really looking for long-term kind of exercise adherence. Another thing in terms of the exercise program, if we can have people exercise in groups or in tandem or with buddies, that's why we have these exercise programs that people come before work sometimes, or maybe at noontime or after work, because you're more likely to continue an exercise program if in fact you have a buddy, friends who are sort of counting on you to exercise, and it also makes it again more fun and enjoyable.
So there we go again, aspects of enjoyment and social support, which are not only important for goal setting, which we've said before, but now we're seeing that it's so pivotal to have that be embedded into any sort of exercise adherence desire. So hopefully that helped make some sense of what we're talking about here. Okay. Now, what I want to present to you, and we're going to go through these quickly, are different theories and models of exercise behavior. In total, we have, let me make sure I have this right. Yep, 7. And again, I keep mentioning this again, but it's hopefully helpful to just reinforce the fact that you should be reading your text in addition to listening to these presentations. Your text goes into a little bit more detail on some particular ones. The one that I'm going to spend the most time on is on the trans-theoretical model, because this is one that I've used before and one that I know pretty well, and I think can explain pretty well and give you hopefully some good examples as it relates. So when trying to explain the reason why people do exercise and the reasons and the reasons why and why not people would stick to exercise, these are again the theories, the explanations that have come to fruition. Health belief model. In this model, the likelihood of exercising depends on the person's perception of severity of health risks and appraisal, the cost and benefits of taking action. So in other words, this model suggests that people are worried about things like obesity, osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, and that fear, that cost of life or cost of everyday comfortability that comes with those health risks forces the people to exercise. One of the downsides to this model is that it really takes away the fact that some people want to, aside from the health benefits, want to exercise for just enjoyment. And as we just saw from some of the things I've been talking about earlier, and as well as the video we just watched with Dr. Rob, enjoyment really does have to be a big part of exercise in order to continue prolonged adherence, if not for most people, if not all people. Theory of planned behavior. This theory suggests that exercise behavior is made up of intentions, subjective norms and attitudes, and perceptions of ability to control behavior. So in other words, with this theory, people are deciding what to do, and essentially people are understanding that they have to behave in a certain way to improve certain things. So in other words, they have goals set in mind and they know they have to use exercise as a strategy to reach those goals. And I think hopefully through that, they normalize the fact that as those goals are met, they continue to do that behavior. Social cognitive theory. This theory suggests that exercise behavior is influenced by personal behavior, environmental factors, particularly self-efficacy. So in other words, if someone, generally has a capability to exercise, wants to exercise, maybe they're in an environment that is inducive to exercise. Maybe there's someone in there's a member of the family and everyone else in their family exercise. So they grew up with having a pretty active lifestyle, when they look at their siblings, other family members, maybe their parents, Maybe they're working at a place, maybe they're working in an industry that's associated with sport and exercise, so they're more likely to exercise. So again, there's that personal piece, there's that behavioral piece, and then there's that environmental piece to this theory. Self-determination theory, people, and this kind of goes with what Dr. Rob was saying as it relates to people more comfortable working out with a buddy. So generally, this theory suggests that people, when they feel a sense of relatedness, in terms of they have others that want to exercise with them, that encourage them to become autonomous in their exercise, or they have people that they look up to, whether it's a parent, a coach, that they become eventually self-determined, not only to feel connected in terms of exercising with them and with others, but ultimately to develop that intrinsic motivation, that sense of personal initiative to growing exercise. So again, it's kind of this theory, it's a ongoing process to get from feeling like you need to be connected to others by exercising and leading up until ideally that intrinsic motivation. Okay, and here's the model I kind of highlighted at the beginning of all this. So this is the trans-theoretical model. In this model, it's a 6-part model that highlights 6 stages of change. Now, the National Academy of Sports Medicine focuses on this model as it relates to personal trainers having to know or having to find out where their clients are in this model. And depending on where in the process of change their clients are, the personal trainer can recommend specific recommendations. So let me explain. If someone comes for a personal training consult, right, whatever they have to do to get there, just the fact that they're there, present, they're already in the contemplation phase. Because if someone never ever thinks about exercise, exercise is not even something that they read about, they think about, they talk to about with anybody. It's not a factor in their life. They just live their life and word exercise doesn't even come up. Then they're in pre-contemplation. But if they think about, things such as, well, I could potentially start walking more, or, my doctor did say this, maybe I should think about it, or maybe I'll go check out this gym, see what it looks like, maybe talk to someone. Then we're in the contemplation, right? They're thinking about things, they're contemplating about changes to their behavior that could take place to, again, potentially improve some aspects of their life. And then maybe, let's say, they sign up. And now they sign up and then they go, they have a gym membership. Maybe they go on a good week, twice a week for 30 minutes or so. But then some weeks they go once a week for about an hour. And then other weeks they don't go at all. And they kind of go irregularly for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months. Now they're in the preparation phase. They've made an effort to physically start exercising, but not regular enough to really see some health outcomes. There's no rigor, there's no structure. Next phase, action phase. So then this individual becomes a little bit more serious about exercising, and they say, okay, now I'm going to find my rhythm. Maybe I'll go 3 to 4 times a week, work out for 45 minutes each time, do this, do that. So there's more of a rigor, but it's still really new. So now they're finally taking action, and this time that has passed has only been less than 6 months. And then once you pass that 6 months threshold, if they keep doing that regular exercise, then they're in the maintenance. Ideally, hopefully they're increasing their intensity of exercise at this point as well. And when someone maintains this for longer than 5 years, according to this model, then the change has completely taken place. So it's a termination stage, but it doesn't mean they stop exercise, just means that they finally committed into a lifestyle of exercise. So the comment that I made earlier, where I said that personal trainers have to find out where the people that come in to work with them, where they are, because if someone is in the contemplation phase, the personal trainer can give that person more information to say, oh, you're thinking about exercise. you should, because of X, Y, and Z, and just how we spent some time today talking about all the benefits, both physiologically and psychologically, particularly as it ties into psychological well-being, depression, anxiety, mood states. All that information is being shared with the client. Respectfully, of course, you don't want to overwhelm people, but you're telling them, you're convincing them, hey, this is a really good idea. But if that client is met in the preparation phase, you want to, as a personal trainer, you want to acknowledge their efforts, but explain to them how consistency is going to be key, right? To really reach those benefits that got, or the desire of those benefits that got them to exercise in the first place. And with action, of course, you encourage that. Maybe you tweak their regular exercise, maintenance, you develop a maintenance program for them. And then, ideally, I guess by the time you get to the termination stage with them, at that point, they're completely self-sufficient. They don't need you. Sorry. Or they work with you occasionally just to kind of, keep things diversified and so forth. So most clients that from a personal training standpoint are going to be either in the contemplation phase or at best, probably the preparation phase. You might see some people in the action phase who, try to do it on their own, but they're not seeing what they want to do. So they are there for you. But again, biggest distinction between pre-contemplation and contemplation is that those thoughts, right? The thought that, oh, when you start thinking about exercise, because it probably is a good idea, then that person starts engaging in that stages, in that process of change. Just to finish out the other models, we have the ecological model. This one focuses a lot on environment and behavior, similar to one of the models we talked about earlier. But here we're breaking down the models into the categories of interpersonal, institutional, and policy influences. And then the last model here, the physical activity maintenance model. This one's sort of like a pretty wide open model where this model more or less suggests that goal setting, self-motivation, self-efficacy, physical environment, physical activity environment, and life stress all play a role in the maintenance of physical activity. So in other words, the better people are in these categories, the more likely they are to keep up with physical activity. I think that makes sense, right? That's not that hard to wrap our heads around. And to no one's surprise, in order to figure out how people are going to behave when it relates to exercise, it's really a combination of all those things that give us an indication of what's going on, right? From my experience, and again, I might be a little biased because of my previous training and certifications, I really like the trans-theoretical stages of change, because I like how, for me, they're practical in that you can identify exactly where people are on the stages of change, and then you can make recommendations based on where people are, and then especially helping people get through that maintenance and eventual termination phase, stage, I should say, is pretty it's pretty rewarding, and I think it's a good goal to have. Okay, in addition to looking at the theories and models that we just looked at to try to further understand exercise behavior and some things that influence it, there are also these things called specific determinants, which are, of course, personal factors, environmental factors. So just more things that can change, that can influence whether or not a person exercises. And if they do, how well they they adhere to a particular program. Examples of personal factors include, of course, demographic variables, different personality traits, different cognitive mindsets, behaviors. There's an example down there for you of a demographic variable. Environmental factors include the social environment, the physical environment. Again, you could see how when we looked at the barriers, you could see how both personal factors and environmental factors can become, unfortunately, barriers. So, sometimes, again, I know I said this earlier, but I just want to reinforce it. It's going to take creativity on the part of the personal trainer, the coach, you trying to get people to exercise, whatever your role is, to overcome some of these barriers. Okay, almost at the end, I promise. So how can we get people to stick to exercise. Now that we realize that adherence is a problem, and we're trying to better understand why some people may not stick, may not adhere to their exercise. Different strategies exist, and we group these strategies into 6 categories of techniques. These include behavioral modification approaches, reinforcement, cognitive behavioral decision-making, social support, and intrinsic. So I'm going to go through these categories, and then we're going to wrap up our presentation. So our first category, behavioral modification approaches. Here, again, remember, these are all strategies for enhancing adherence. So things we can do to help people stick to their program. So behavior modification is now we are using prompts such as different verbal and physical and symbolic cues to encourage people to get to exercise. This includes laying out your workout clothes the night before, right? To encourage you to go to the gym, rearranging your schedule to go to the gym. Again, having maybe some sort of motivational thing in your presence to get you to go to exercise. Using, and this is huge when we start talking about technology, using maybe a Fitbit or an Apple Watch to remind you to go exercise, to go walking, to even the stand feature, right? Any of you that have this type of watch, it doesn't have to be an Apple Watch, could be any type of technical watch. Many of them come with reminders telling you to stand, telling you to, and sometimes take a deep breath when you're breathing too much, to move around, to close your rings. These are all types of prompts that have been put in by the manufacturers to again encourage behavior, because they really encourage behavior that ties in with exercise, because they realize the importance and all the benefits of exercise. Our second category, reinforcement approaches. So here, things are done to continue to encourage showing up, attendance. So maybe now attendance actually getting documented. There might be reward programs, but the reward programs have to be long-term, right? This can't just be a short-term thing, because if it's a short-term thing, then you lose out on the adherence part. I've seen this happen in gyms where, people get points for attending, for taking classes, for doing certain things. And then with those points, they can use those points for other things throughout the length of the entire program. Getting feedback, whether you're someone else as part of a group working out with your buddies, or you are a coach, right? If you tell someone good things and point out the things they're doing well, they're more likely to come back. And just general records of their progress, whether it's records of how long they were able to run without stopping, how their heart rate was over a period of time, certain activity. Or you think about, this comes up a lot in people that want to get involved in strength training, your 1RM, right? How heavy you can lift a certain amount of weight, right? That makes people feel good when they're able to see their progress there. So again, just things you can do, and they're little, to, kind of give yourself a pat on the back and reinforce that behavior. Category 3, cognitive behavior approaches. Here is an emphasis on goal setting. So now we set goals that come from the individual. The goals are used to motivate again, and think back to when we talk about goal setting, we know they should be SMART goals. So with these approaches, what you're doing is you're setting exercise related goals that can be relatively flexible. They can adjust, because we know that adjustment of goals is really, really important. And again, they're coming from the individual person themselves. It's not necessarily the personal trainer or the coach that's forcing the goals on the person, but instead the person is perceiving the goals in their mind, creating this cognitive framework of the goals. And you would hope that by them creating these goals, the behavior will match up and stick to adherence. Category 4, decision-making approaches. This includes helping people see how exercise is a logical decision. So, you might think of a pro-con list, benefits, benefits versus harm list, maybe taking a more logical approach that aids them in making that decision for themselves. And also another thing I want to point out is personal trainers can take great advantage of these types of approaches, because this means that they take input from their clients and they ask them, what things do you like? Let's try this, let's try that. Do you not like this exercise? Do you not like? Maybe the client that they're working with absolutely hates running on a treadmill. If that's the case, don't put that client on a treadmill. Find other ways, and there's plenty of other ways to get them to do a similar type of activity, or have them get their heart rate for an extended period of time like you need them as part of that program. That's part of the program, right? Being flexible. And if you engage and you give clients, you give people a little bit more say in what they want to do, then they're more likely to adhere to it because it's something they said. Social support approaches, this one's pretty straightforward. People being motivated by other people, other environments, whether it's participation in a small group, using personal feedback, buddy system like we referenced before, just things that are very supportive from their environment, that are encouraging them to keep exercising. Let's say if it's a spouse, and every day, the spouse is encouraging, is texting, his or her husband or wife, hey, make sure you go to the gym today, or good luck at the gym, have a great workout. Even those little things count as social support. Or maybe that individual goes with his or her wife or husband and they, exercise together. That would count as social support. And then lastly, but not least, we have different intrinsic approaches. These are probably the ones that are going to lead to the best adherence. And the reason I say that is because these approaches are ones where finally the athlete, the person exercising, develops a sense of intrinsic motivation. They start to focus on the experience. They start to enjoy the experience. They begin buying into the process of doing it. And if they find what they're doing to be purposeful and meaningful and they like it, then that's your big ticket item. That is where you want to be, because that is where they're going to stick to adherence for a long period of time. And ideally, that's what you want, right? We want a long life of a healthy lifestyle, where you can exercise and reap the benefits of exercise, both on the physical side and the psychological side. Okay, and there we are. Thank you very much.